Growing up as a twin should have been a bond I cherished, but in reality, it became a lifelong competition, one I had no chance of winning. My brother and I, both 28 now, couldn't be more different. Since childhood, he was considered the golden child, the future success story. Me, I was the troublemaker, the disappointment, or whatever other label my parents felt like branding me with. Their praise for him felt limitless while I barely existed in their eyes. Birthdays were the most blatant examples of our family's twisted dynamics. Every year, they threw my brother a lavish party, complete with all the friends he could want, gifts, and cakes stacked high. My birthday? An afterthought. I might get a cheap cake or a card, but the attention was all on him. Even when I tried to invite friends over, they wouldn't allow it. "Your friends are bad influences," they'd say, as if they'd ever taken the time to know them. Over time, I began to feel like I didn't belong in my own family. The one bright spot was my grandmother, who'd occasionally slip me some cash or bring my favorite chocolates whenever she visited. She was the only one who saw me for who I was, rather than through the lens of my parents' misplaced judgment. But as the years went on, the favoritism became sharper, crueler, and darker. My interests, my achievements, and even my personality were all ridiculed by my parents. I was good at sports, something that brought me joy and confidence, yet they crushed it. "You need to focus on your studies, like your brother," they'd tell me, constantly ignoring any success I had on the field. It felt as if every part of me, every spark of individuality, was something they wanted to snuff out. My sophomore year of high school was when things took a sharp turn for the worse. They grounded me, yet again, over something trivial. This time because I had Snapchat on my phone. I hadn't done anything wrong. It was just an app, a way to keep in touch with friends like every other teenager. But to my parents, it was as if I'd committed some kind of crime. They stormed into my room, screaming, throwing things, and eventually removing the door from its hinges, as if I didn't even deserve privacy. That door was symbolic, really. It marked the final severance of any respect they may have once had for me. Amidst all this, my twin brother saw an opportunity. Instead of stepping up to defend me, he joined in, adding fuel to the fire. He lied constantly. If he stole something, he'd pin it on me. My parents, already inclined to believe the worst, accepted his stories without question. And as my self-worth was being torn down at home, he started doing the same thing at school. Behind my back, he spread lies and rumors, things I'd never even imagined doing. At first, I didn't think much of it, but gradually I began noticing my friends pulling away, their trust in me eroded by his words. One day, I finally confronted my brother. I asked him to stop, to please just leave me alone, but he simply smirked and told me that I deserved to be miserable. His words shook me to the core. It was a venom I hadn't realized he possessed. When my 14th birthday came around, I hoped, against all odds, that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But unsurprisingly, it wasn't. My brother's party was the talk of the school, complete with decorations, gifts, and a bunch of kids from our class. The thing is, none of his friends showed up. He sat there, waiting and humiliated. But it didn't take him long to find a way to make me pay for his bad day. My friends took me out for ice cream that evening, and I had a good time. My brother seethed. Not just because his day had been ruined, but because I'd actually managed to have a good time with friends. That was the day he took his lies to a whole new level. He started spreading rumors about me at school, saying I was a bully, that I'd hurt him, and even hinting that I was somehow dangerous. When that didn't get the reaction he wanted, he escalated it in the most twisted way. He began inflicting injuries on himself. I'd see him with a fresh bruise, a scraped arm, or a black eye, and I'd feel worried. I had no idea he was doing it to himself, but he made sure others thought I was responsible. Soon enough, people at school started whispering about me. The friendly smiles turned into sidelong glances, and those who once enjoyed hanging out with me now looked at me as if I were some kind of monster. My ex-best friend even told me that my brother had been telling everyone that I was violent and that he was afraid of me. Hearing that broke something in me. I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt like I'd lost everything that made me, me. I tried talking to my friends, explaining that it was all lies, but they couldn't ignore the evidence my brother had so conveniently provided. Soon, I felt completely isolated, trapped in a world where my own family and friends saw me as the enemy. When the rumors reached the school administration, my nightmare only deepened. The principal called my parents and me into his office along with my brother to discuss these allegations. I thought for sure that in the face of authority, my brother would have to tell the truth, but instead, he spun an elaborate story about how I'd been tormenting him, painting me as a bully consumed by jealousy. It was a story that seemed too wild to be true, but my parents, always quick to believe the worst in me, swallowed it whole. My mother clung to my brother, comforting him as if he'd just survived some horrible ordeal, while my father spoke with the principal about discipline and the shame I'd brought to the family. They didn't look at me as their daughter, someone they knew and raised. They looked at me like I was a problem to be dealt with, an embarrassment to be swept under the rug. The principal decided to make an example out of me. I was suspended for 10 days and he gave me a long lecture about the school's zero-tolerance policy on bullying. I sat there, feeling like I was drowning, pleading with them to believe me. But they were set on their decision. My father dragged me out of the office, humiliated and furious, muttering about how he couldn't let me ruin our family's reputation. When we got home, I thought the worst was over, that at least I'd have a few days to try and process everything. But my father had other plans. He began packing up my belongings. I didn't realize what was happening at first, watching him as if he'd lost his mind. But then it hit me. He was throwing me out. My own parents were kicking me out of my home, the place I'd lived my whole life. I begged them to let me stay and swore I'd done nothing wrong, but they were deaf to my pleas. My brother stood there, silent but smug, watching as our father tossed my things by the door. They told me to leave and never come back. That night, my grandmother came to get me. She gathered my belongings, gently helping me into the car while I sobbed. Before we left, she confronted my parents, warning them that if they ever tried to hurt me again, she wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities. She spoke with a fire I'd never seen before, and it was the first time in my life I felt genuinely protected. As we drove away, I stared back at the house, feeling hollow. I was only 14 and already cast out, disowned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The pain was indescribable. I spent nights crying in my grandmother's guest room, trying to understand how my life had spiraled into this nightmare. Despite everything, my grandmother was there for me, her unwavering support keeping me from completely falling apart. But as much as her love soothed me, I couldn't shake the overwhelming loneliness. Returning to school after my suspension was like walking back into a war zone. Whispers followed me down every hallway. The classmates who once laughed at my jokes now looked away or sneered as I passed. Rumors about me had taken on a life of their own, morphing into something uglier than I could have ever imagined. No matter how many times I tried to explain or defend myself, people had already made up their minds. My brother's lies had solidified into truth in everyone's eyes. The few friends I had left kept their distance, afraid of being tainted by association. I'd see them in the cafeteria or outside at lunch, laughing and talking like we used to. But now there was a gap between us I couldn't bridge. Alone, I kept my head down and focused on surviving each day. I sat by myself in class, barely said a word, and went straight home afterward. The isolation was suffocating, but I had nowhere else to go. My parents? They never reached out. Not once. Not to ask if I was okay. Not to see if I needed anything. Just silence. They'd written me off as easily as if I'd been a stranger. It stung more deeply than I'd like to admit, but my grandmother constantly reminded me that their actions weren't a reflection of my worth. She believed in me and did everything she could to make me feel loved and safe. She was my anchor in a sea of judgment and cruelty, her steady presence the only thing keeping me afloat. Despite the emotional scars, I pushed through high school. My grades became my silent revenge. I worked tirelessly, burying myself in books and assignments, determined to prove my worth even if no one was watching. I graduated with good grades, but it was a hollow victory. The people I wished would be proud of me weren't even in my life. Graduation day felt like an ending without closure, but at least I knew I could finally leave that school, that town, and that part of my life behind. College was a revelation. For the first time, I could breathe without the constant weight of scrutiny and judgment. I met people who had no idea about my past and saw me for who I was, not who someone else had painted me to be. I found friends who were drawn to my kindness and humor, not afraid to be around me because of twisted rumors. Slowly, I began to feel human again. With a bit of guidance from my professors, I discovered a knack for writing, something I'd always enjoyed but never thought could be a real career. I started taking on small freelance jobs to earn some side money, writing blog posts and product descriptions for small businesses. What began as a side hustle quickly grew into a genuine passion. My work was getting noticed, and I soon built a reputation as a reliable and talented writer. By the time I graduated, I'd amassed a portfolio strong enough to go full-time with content writing. That was when my life began to change. Not only was I financially independent, but I was able to travel as a digital nomad, working from wherever I wanted. I saw cities and countries I'd only dreamed of, meeting people from all walks of life. Each place I visited and each person I met helped heal the wounds of my past, reminding me that my life was no longer defined by my family's betrayal. My grandmother, of course, remained a constant. Though she was sad to see me leave, she understood that I needed to live my own life, and she supported me in every way possible. I visited her whenever I could, cherishing those weekends spent sharing stories over cups of tea, helping her around the house, and joining her on her leisurely walks in the park. She was my real family, the only person who had been there for me without conditions or expectations. My writing career continued to thrive, and with each success, I felt the weight of my past lessen. I worked with prominent clients, received glowing reviews, and even landed a few speaking gigs to share my journey with aspiring writers. One of my proudest moments was being invited back to my college to talk about building a freelance career. Standing in front of those eager students, I spoke openly about my struggles, the challenges I'd faced, and the hard work that had brought me to that moment. Eventually, word of my success began to spread. I posted about my journey on social media, and as my work got shared, more people reached out to congratulate me, including relatives who'd barely acknowledged me before. Even my old principal noticed, reaching out to invite me to speak at an event. It was surreal to be recognized and to see my efforts celebrated instead of scorned. It felt like the life I'd fought for was finally becoming real. But with success came attention from people I hadn't heard from in years. People I'd thought had forgotten me. Or maybe I'd hoped they had. Because soon enough, my parents found out about my success, and the silence they'd once given me turned into something else altogether. A few weeks ago, I was in the middle of a project, phone on silent, when I glanced down and saw 6 missed calls from a number I hadn't seen in years, my mother's. My heart stopped. After all this time, what could she possibly want? Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let the years of silence stay just that. But curiosity got the best of me, and I called her back. The moment she picked up, her tone caught me off guard. She sounded cheerful, almost proud, congratulating me on my recent accomplishments, and even mentioning the news channel interview I'd posted. I stayed polite, answering her questions, but the conversation felt surreal. My father jumped in soon after, asking about my work and life, sounding friendlier than I'd ever remembered. For a second, it almost felt like we were an actual family. But then, the real reason behind the call crept in. After a little small talk, they started mentioning their hard times. My mother spoke about their house needing renovations and how difficult it was for them financially now that they were retired. Then she said, "You're doing so well now. Maybe you could help us out." I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. They hadn't spoken to me in years, hadn't bothered to check in or even apologize for throwing me out of their lives. And now, when things weren't going well for them, they wanted me to swoop in and help. My father chimed in. "We're family after all." I took a deep breath and told them as calmly as I could that I wasn't interested in giving them money. My mother started in with the guilt, saying how ungrateful I was, how they'd raised me and provided for me when I was young, and that helping them out now was the least I could do. My father echoed her, saying that as my parents, they deserved to be taken care of in their old age. The anger rose in me, a fire that had been smoldering for years, waiting for this exact moment. But I didn't want to yell or argue. Instead, an idea hit me, one that would make them see what they had done to me in a way they couldn't ignore. I calmly told them that I would help with their renovations on one condition. They had to publicly admit in front of our entire family that my brother was the one who had spread lies about me, that he had manipulated them into believing I was some kind of monster. They needed to apologize, to own up to the fact that they'd thrown me out of their lives based on nothing but his lies. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost feel their shock. My father stammered, questioning why I would ask something so unnecessary. My mother tried to deflect, suggesting we handle this privately. But I didn't back down. I told them this was non-negotiable. As the conversation grew heated, my father started raising his voice, demanding I respect him as my parent, insisting that I should help them regardless of the past. My mother tried to guilt me further, talking about the sacrifices they'd made, but I wasn't swayed. I reminded them of what they had done, how they had thrown me out without a second thought, and that if they wanted any relationship with me or my support, they'd have to face the truth. Since that day, they've called repeatedly, leaving messages and texts, alternating between begging and trying to guilt me. My brother even sent a nasty text telling me that my ultimatum was ridiculous, that our parents would never turn on him, and accusing me of being selfish for holding a grudge after all these years. His message stung. He dismissed my pain as if it were nothing, mocked me for being unmarried and childless, and implied that I owed them simply because they were my parents. The arrogance, the entitlement. It was as if he truly believed that they'd never wronged me, that I should just forgive and forget because it was convenient for him. I realized that if they could be this callous, even after all this time, they hadn't changed. Their apologies, if they ever came, would only be to get what they wanted. Anger and frustration boiled over, and I decided it was time for them and everyone else in my family to understand the full truth. I sat down and wrote an email to my parents and close relatives. I laid everything bare, the lies, the betrayals, the years of isolation, and the pain they'd caused me. I told them about the day they'd thrown me out, about how I'd had to rebuild my life from scratch, and about how my grandmother had been the only family member who had stood by me. At the end, I attached a screenshot of my brother's recent message where he admitted he'd lied about me back in school. It was all there in black and white, a confession of the harm he'd caused, of the lies he'd spun so easily. I wanted them to see him for who he truly was and to understand the consequences of their blind favoritism. I hit send, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. I knew that once they read it, there'd be no going back. The response to my email was explosive. Within hours, my phone lit up with messages and calls from family members who had no idea about the full story. Some apologized, saying they were sorry for not reaching out sooner or for believing the lies without question. My inbox overflowed with relatives expressing shock and anger, stunned by the truth I'd kept quiet for so long. But my parents' reaction was different. I received a series of texts and voicemails from them and my brother, all more toxic than the last. They accused me of embarrassing the family and of betraying them by airing out our past. My brother, clearly threatened, sent a particularly nasty message calling me selfish for holding on to ancient history. His words were full of contempt, belittling my experiences and telling me to grow up. But he also slipped up, admitting again that he'd lied, that he'd set me up as the villain, just to make his own life easier. Their texts grew uglier with each response, full of anger and self-righteousness, so I decided it was time to put a firm end to it. I reached out to a lawyer who sent them a cease and desist letter. The letter made it clear that if they continued to harass or contact me in any way, they'd be facing serious consequences. For the first time, I felt a sense of control, like I'd finally broken free of their manipulation. Since then, the calls and messages have stopped. My grandmother is the only family I stay close to now, and I'm grateful every day for her strength and love. She has been my safe harbor in a world that often felt like it was set against me, reminding me of my worth when I struggled to see it. She stood by me during the storm, defending me fiercely, proud of who I'd become despite everything I'd faced. In the months that followed, my life continued to evolve in ways I never expected. My work as a writer grew beyond anything I'd imagined, with more speaking invitations and recognition from people who admired my journey. I was proud of how far I'd come, not just professionally, but as someone who'd found the courage to reclaim my own story. One day, my grandmother and I were sitting in her garden, admiring the flowers she'd been tending to for years. She looked at me, her eyes full of pride and love, and said, "You've built a life you can be proud of. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you owe them for what you've earned." Her words settled into my heart, like a balm over old wounds. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Therapy has been a big part of my healing. It's been a long process, but it's helped me unpack years of trauma, understand the roots of my pain, and learn to let go of the anger that used to weigh me down. My therapist reminded me that I don't have to forgive my parents or my brother to heal, that my journey isn't defined by their actions, but by my own strength to move forward. Now, I see my past as a chapter I've finally closed. I'm surrounded by friends and people who respect me for who I am. I have a career that I love, a community that values my voice, and the freedom to choose my own path. My grandmother remains a cornerstone of my life, and I cherish every moment with her, knowing she's the family who truly matters. Reflecting on everything, I don't regret setting those boundaries with my parents or refusing to be manipulated by them again. They've shown me who they are, and I finally accepted it. Sometimes choosing yourself is the hardest decision you'll ever make, but it's also the most necessary. For anyone who's gone through something similar, I hope my story reminds you that you're not alone. Healing isn't linear, and the journey is long, but in the end, you'll find peace. I have, and though the scars will always be there, they're now part of a story I'm proud to own.